actually filmed this video several months ago, but then when I was editing it the other day, I realized that the audio was complete garbage. I filmed it again yesterday, and then I realized that I was out of focus for half of the video, which was super awesome. So I am filming it now for the third time. Hopefully it turns out good. I was trying to find the silver lining in all of this, and it kind of worked out because the Sony A7R5 just was announced, so I can compare the A7 IV to the R5, as well as throwing the A7C into the mix, which is what I was already planning on doing. But anyways, what's up you guys? My name is Courtney. Welcome to my channel. And as you probably already guessed, I'm going to be talking about the Sony A7 IV today. Some of you may have seen one of my other videos. The Sony A7C was my very first exchangeable lens camera, and it was a really big upgrade from anything that I had ever had before. When I was choosing what to get as my first exchangeable lens, I kind of was looking at the A7S3 as well as the A7R4. But it was a really tough decision because the A7S3 is more geared towards video. It only has 12 megapixels, but it's like really amazing in low light. And then the A7R4 has 61 megapixels, which is amazing for photography, but it was already several years old at that point. So that kind of made me hesitate to get it because it was lacking a lot of the technology that, you know, the A7S3 had and some of the other newer Sony cameras had as well. Plus, I just wasn't sure if I wanted a camera that was geared more towards photography or for filmmaking. So when the A7C came out, I was like, this is the perfect camera. It was going to be the perfect middle ground between making videos and then for photography as well. Plus, it was way cheaper than either of them. And then when the Sony A7 IV came out in December 2021, so a year later basically from me having the Sony A7C, I thought that it was a worthwhile upgrade, so I ended up having to sadly sell my A7C to get the A7 IV. And I kind of almost did the exact same thing again when the Sony A7R5 came out. I have not caved in and bought that camera yet, but for now I have the Sony A7 IV as my primary camera, which I'm actually filming with. As I mentioned, I was out of focus for half of the other videos, so I decided instead of using my Sony ZV-E10, I should use my A7 IV so that way I can make sure that I'm in focus with the focus mapping, which I'll get to, but it's definitely one of my favorite features about this camera. So before I get into my thoughts and opinions about each one of these cameras, I'm gonna go through some of the specs really quickly for you guys. First off, a little bit of a disclaimer, it's definitely not an even playing field with these three cameras. The A7C is significantly less of a camera than the Sony A7R5, and then the A7 IV I kind of feel like is a middle ground between them, although it is priced a little bit more closely to the A7C. And the thing that I really like about the Sony A7C as well as the A7 IV is that they are really geared towards just being good at making videos as well as for photography, where the A7R5 is much more of a specialized photography camera, the same way that the A7 III is specialized for making videos. So it might be a little unfair to compare the A7C to the A7R5, but I feel like there are probably people who are comparing one or two of these cameras, so I just wanted to throw out my thoughts on all of them and some of the specs, and then it could hopefully help somebody out there who's trying to make their decision between one or more of these cameras. So the A7C starts out at $1,798. The A7 IV comes in at $2,498, and then the A7R5 jumps all the way up to $3,898. So again, the pricing varies pretty widely between these three cameras, but the A7 IV is priced pretty fairly in between the two of them, I would say. All three of these cameras are full-frame mirrorless cameras by Sony. I still believe that the Sony A7C is Sony's best entry-level full-frame mirrorless camera. It does have the Sony ZV-E10, which is definitely a very entry-level exchangeable lens camera, but that's an ASPC sensor, so you're paying a lot less money for that. I mean, that camera doesn't even have a viewfinder, so it's geared towards vloggers. But the A7C is definitely a very fairly priced entry-level, higher-end camera if you're interested in upgrading something that's a little bit more substantial than the ZV-E10. But as soon as you start looking at full-frame mirrorless cameras, those two factors are going to make the camera you're looking at much more expensive already. So the A7C has 24 megapixels, the A7 IV has 33 megapixels, and then it jumps way up to 61 megapixels when you look at the R5, which is just crazy to me, and probably one of the top factors that makes me really consider getting the R5. The A7C and the A7 IV both have the same ISO range, so from 100 to 51,200. The R5 actually has the lowest range for the ISO and only goes up to 32,000, but when you extend the ISO, I think that they're all equal. Based on that information and the fact that the pixels are so much smaller on the R5, I believe that means that the R5 should theoretically perform the least well in low light compared to all of these cameras, so maybe that's something that you want to consider. Both the A7 IV and the R5 have the added dial that's pretty new still on Sony cameras that allows you to quickly change between photo, video, or S&Q mode, which I have definitely found very useful. And the A7R4 actually has an additional locking mechanism on the top of the dial, so you can't actually bump yourself from like manual to, you know, aperture priority or something by accident, which is a nice safety feature that the R5 has that neither of the other two cameras have. And then each of the camera progressively has more white balance settings and recording modes, as well as photo formats. I honestly don't fully understand the difference between a lot of them, but I know like people are always referring to S-Log and to 422 10-bit, which both the R5 and the A7IV do have 422 10-bit. But yeah, definitely if recording formats are important to you, make sure you look at the specs more closely for each of the camera, because you will be the most limited with what you can record and film and take photos with the A7C compared to the other two cameras. Next, all three cameras have no recording limit, which seems to kind of just be the way all of these cameras are going at this point. But if you are recording in 8K with the R5, which is the only camera that can record in 8K, you will be limited to 30 minutes of recording. They all have pretty impressive autofocus. I think Sony still is very much at the top of their game with autofocus. The A7C is pretty good, and then the A7IV, I believe, has the same autofocus as the A7S III, which a lot of people were really blown away by. But then the R5 takes it a step further, and they have this new AI processor that works with the autofocus, and I've seen tests of it, and it is really impressive how it can just track the human body and eye so much better than you can do with either of the other cameras, or I think maybe any of the cameras to this point, except for like maybe the A1. So if having a lot of autofocus features and reliability is important to you, then the R5 might be the best camera for you. I would say that's definitely a very useful feature for people who are photographing events and want to make sure, you know, that the bride's face is always in focus. I think you can save faces in some of the other Sony cameras, including the A7IV, but I don't know if maybe it doesn't work as well. Like, I haven't really researched that. But out of all three of the cameras, for sure, the R5 is definitely going to be the most powerful and responsive autofocus out of these three cameras right now. One of my favorite features that I was really excited about that came out on the A7IV is focus mapping. As I mentioned, I'm having to film this video for the third time because the second video I was out of focus for a lot of it. I'll insert clip here, and that was me using the Sony ZV-E10. You know, I'm using a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, so I have the camera probably 3 feet away from me right now. So only looking at the little LCD, or even looking, you know, through imaging edge on my iPad or computer or whatever, I couldn't still tell that I wasn't in focus. So with focus mapping, it's really obvious with these blocks of color that right now I'm in focus and everything else around me is not in focus the way that it's supposed to be. Obviously, it'd be nice to be holding my A7IV to be showing you right now, but I didn't want to risk being out of focus for half the video again. So I decided to just use my A7IV to film this video. But yeah, the focus mapping is much more handy than I even anticipated, and that's something you're only going to get on the A7IV and the A7R5. The viewfinder gets larger and a higher resolution with each camera. The A7C is definitely the most lacking viewfinder out of all of the three. I had never had a viewfinder before, so I thought that the A7C was like, oh, this is really nice to have. And then as soon as I got the A7IV, I was like, okay, that's what people are complaining about. It's definitely not as comfortable looking through the A7C, and it's a lot smaller. Plus, it doesn't have the hood, so when you're outside, it's a lot harder to view it in bright daylight. So having the nicer viewfinder is nice. And then the A7R5 is even bigger and nicer than the A7IV. And the same is kind of true with the LCD. I think the A7C and the A7IV are very comparable in size and in resolution, but then the R5 gets bigger and the resolution jumps up quite a bit. All three of the cameras have the ability to do a flip out screen, but the thing that really puts the R5 ahead of almost any other Sony camera, I think at this moment for me, is the ability to do a 4-axis tilt. So you can do the flip out, but you also have the ability to tilt it up and down, which I think is something photographers prefer more, where the flipping out is something that people who do videos more seem to prefer. So with the A7R5, you're getting the best of both worlds with that screen. Between that and the 61 megapixels, I was like, if this thing wasn't almost $4,000, I would definitely probably have gotten it by this point. So just a few more specs. When it comes to ports, you are only getting one standard SD card with the A7C. With the A7IV, you're getting 2 standard SD card slots and a CF Express Type A. And then the R5 gets even crazier, and you get 2 standards and 2 CF Express Type A slots. So if you plan on recording just like a ton of content, or you want to have a lot of options for recording formats, or even just having the redundancy and doing backup recording, the A7C would be the worst option for you when it comes to that, because it only has 1 slot. But then the R5 and the A7IV definitely would give you a lot of option, but obviously the R5 has the most, so that might be something to consider. All of them have 3.5 headphone and microphone jacks, but the A7IV and the R5 have full HDMI, which a lot of people prefer to the A7C, which only has the mini HDMI. And the R5 is the only one that has this thing that I had to look up what it was. It's a PC sync socket. I guess it's for photography, and it allows you to synchronize your shutter and your flash. So if photography photography is your main focus, that's just one of the probably many reasons that the R5 camera might be the better option for you. And then maybe the last factor is if you're looking for portability, the A7C definitely is the smallest. It comes in at 509 grams, where the A7IV jumps up to 658 grams. And despite having pretty much the exact same body to the R5 goes up in weight a little bit more to 723 grams. Again, the R5 and the A7IV both have pretty much the same body. It has a much comfortable grip. So if you plan on using the camera for long shoots, whether photography or videos, the A7C might be the most uncomfortable for you to hold. I think you can get extension handles for the A7C, so that's possibly not a deal breaker. But if you're just looking to do some like quick street photography, something that's more portable, the A7C is definitely the most portable of those three cameras. All of that to say, basically you get what you pay for. But for real, they are all very solid entry-level to mid-range Sony full-frame mirrorless cameras. I think most people, even beginners, honestly, would be able to get amazing content with any of these cameras. I remember the first time that I used the Sony A7C, just putting in auto, I was pretty blown away just with the pictures that I had taken, especially when you compare it to like the only thing I really had to compare to was my iPhone at the time. I think anybody will be blown away with what they can get from these cameras. Obviously, the better that they know how to use them, the better the content will be. But the A7C is probably the least intimidating of the three because it has the least amount of options and settings to go through. It's the most budget friendly and it's the most portable. So if you're really just a beginner, you're maybe not even sure if you're gonna like photography or making videos, then the A7C, I feel like you'd be really, really safe with that camera. But if you want a more professional feel to a camera that you have more options with and you have probably more ability to grow, then the A7IV and the R5 would be more of the camera for you. You are paying an extra $1,000 to get the A7IV, but I honestly feel like the cost is kind of justified with all the additional features that you're getting with the A7IV. It is a really, really nice camera. I think a lot of people have even referred to it as being the best for video and photo. Obviously, the flagship A1 camera I think is just the best of everything. So for a very reasonable price tag, you're getting an amazing photo and video camera with the A7IV. But if money is not an option for you and photo is definitely your focus, the R5 is an amazing camera, but it does come at an additional $1,400 just from the A7IV. And then that's even more money than that. I think it's an additional like $3,000 in the A7C. Whether the 61 megapixels and the screen and then the additional AI processing for the autofocus is worth it to you, I don't know. I'm, like I said, considering getting it still. Maybe not right now, maybe sometime down in the future a little bit. But I do feel like the R5 is probably going to be the most intimidating for people to use if they don't fully understand what they're doing because it's such a large sensor and so many megapixels. I hear that there's a lot of complicated things that that camera does with binning, cropping, and downsampling. So I'm not sure how many of those things you'd even really notice if you did the settings. The camera kind of just automatically does it, but that might be something that's kind of frustrating to somebody trying to figure out what the best recording modes that they want to use are. So I would say for that reason, the R5 would be the most intimidating. I maybe wouldn't recommend it for that reason to somebody who is more of a beginner, that and like the price tag, obviously. Bottom line, if you were looking for a camera that is really great at photo and video, I honestly think you might be better suited towards the A7C or the A7IV, and I would choose between the A7C and the A7IV based off of your budget as well as how much of a beginner you are. If you're like really a beginner, you're probably going to be very impressed with the A7C if you're going just from like an iPhone or, you know, a phone in general. But then if you're looking and you want to make sure you have more room to grow and you're not as intimidated by some of the settings, then the A7IV would be probably the best option for you. If you're a professional photographer or you're looking to get into professional photography, the A7R5, if you have the money, would be definitely an amazing camera that I think you'd be blown away with. You're just gonna have to take a little bit more time, you know, dialing in the settings, which is a little bit easier to do on the R5 and the A7IV. That's something I forgot to mention. The A7IV and the R5 have the newer Sony menu system layout, which is a lot nicer than the A7C, but if you've never used any of the menu systems before, it's not that hard to navigate really any of them, but the new menu system is definitely a lot nicer to navigate than what the A7C has. I don't think you should necessarily make your decision on which camera you'd buy off of the menu system, but just throwing that out there that the A7IV and the R5 have the better, newer menu system for Sony. But if you're not a professional photographer and you're not planning and cropping in on your photos a lot, the R5 is gonna be overkill for you. Getting the A7C, that photography is the thing that I enjoy doing more besides making these YouTube videos. I kind of don't really film that much. I end up, you know, taking my camera and doing much more photography than anything else. And I don't feel like buying a whole bunch of telephoto lenses. So I'm like, well, if I have 61 megapixels, I can just crop in a lot more and then I don't need to buy a telephoto lens right now. But yeah, that's just kind of how my mind works. So maybe in 6 months or so, you'll see me making a video on the R5. But for now, I am very happy with my A7 IV, and if I don't end up upgrading, I don't necessarily think I'm going to regret it because I've been very happy with it so far. But yeah, so I think that that is about it for this video. If you stuck around, I really appreciate it, and I hope that this was helpful for you. Hopefully, if you were deciding between one or more of these cameras, I was able to maybe help you make your decision. Feel free to leave any questions or comments down below. I would love to know which cameras you guys are choosing between, or perhaps after watching this video, which camera you have decided to get for yourself. So for the third time of making this video, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you hit that like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next video.